Are you interested in sleeping with your friend's wife, or going around trying to assassinate people? Then Crusader Kings 3 is the game for you. With its new expansion being released not so long ago, we see many people getting excited for the future of the game. Its role-playing nature and future plans make it a game that is likely to perhaps grow out of the Paradox niche, and become an even bigger game in the future. Something I've always wondered though for both Crusader Kings 2 and Crusader Kings 3 is why Paradox have chosen the start date of 867. In one of my other videos, I discussed why they chose 1066 in great detail, but 867 is far more obscure. So what makes 867 so special, and why did Paradox choose it, despite it being somewhat unknown for most people? In EE4, 1444 was chosen specifically to balance the game, instead of a more famous date of 1453. So, in Crusader Kings 3, they must have a solid reason for picking this start date. And actually, the reasons for this start date are actually somewhat similar to that of 1066, and both these start dates, in my opinion, are Anglo-centric. In today's video, therefore, we discuss what the reasons are behind the choosing of the start date 867, and what other start dates could have been potentially chosen around this time. We are also planning an old meetup at 100,000 subscribers, so why not click that button? I could even bring my Crusader Kings 3 blanket. Right, let's get into the video. So let's begin with one of the main reasons for this CK3 start date of 867. I'd argue this start date is chosen because of the Great Heathen Viking Army. This was a coalition army of Scandinavian warriors who invaded England in 865. The Vikings before this date had been raiding England for decades. The clearest cause for the Viking raids was a simple acquisition of wealth. The monks in their monasteries had virtually no protection against the raids, and these monasteries were full of chalices, crosses, decorated books, and other valuable objects, meaning they were easy targets for raiding, rather than a fortified French town with less wealth. Even though the monks eventually did fortify, as they could no longer stand being killed by these Vikings, it wasn't enough, and we can see from this map that a lot of these holy sites were isolated. A very famous holy island was Linda's Farm, and we can still see what's left over of this monastery today. You can probably picture that it was decimated by the Vikings, since it was right on the coast, and it was one of the first Viking raids in 793. Decades after the beginning of the raids, the Vikings wanted to control the land and establish a permanent base. Legend has it that the Vikings invaded because the king of Northumbria killed a famous Viking warrior, Ragnar Lothbrok, and chucked him into a pit of snakes where he was slowly bitten to death. Many historians would disagree that Ragnar existed in the way he was portrayed, and many of his stories were seen as fiction, although in recent years, scholars have come to accept at least part of Ragnar's story was based on historical fact. Regardless of whatever reason the Vikings invaded, the Anglo-Saxons were certainly not prepared for the Great Heathen Army. Maybe the monks needed a bit more training. Now you may be wondering why Crusader Kings 3 doesn't start in 865, with this great big Viking army making sandcastles on the beaches of Northumbria. My guess is Paradox wanted the Vikings to already have some land on the British Isles, and York fell in 867 to the Great Heathen Army. Therefore, you have this interesting political situation in the north of England between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, which makes for great gameplay. You therefore have one of the hardest starts in CK3 with the King of Northumbria, who historically died the same year as the start date and had a brutal execution by the Vikings. In Crusader Kings 3, Northumbria also starts off in 2 wars against the Vikings, and is heavily outnumbered in both, despite having allies to call upon. In the south of England as well, you can also play as King Alfred the Great, although he was only an earl during this time. All these reasons combined is therefore probably a strong reason to have 867 as a CK3 start date. Also, who doesn't want to play as either the Boneless or Bjorn Ironside? The Vikings would continue with the Great Heathen Army and would dominate the British Isles for decades to come. But maybe in Crusader Kings 3 you can prevent this as one of the petty English kings, although it is quite difficult. Given the internationally famous TV series Vikings, a lot of Paradox players would have probably heard of the majority of these characters in this start date, so it's no wonder they have kept this in the game. I'd personally recommend playing as Edmund the Martyr, who historically was brutally killed by the Vikings at this time. This start date was also made possible in Crusader Kings 2 with the release of the Old Gods DLC. So, besides the Viking invasion, did anything else historically relevant happen besides the fall of York? Well, going to the other side of Europe in 867, we see the start of a Byzantine Empire revival under the Macedonian dynasty. Basil I, who was emperor at this time, went from being a mere peasant to one of the most powerful men in Europe and murdered people in order to get there. He's shown in game as brave and ambitious. Historically, he also made the Greek legal code, so perhaps some sort of intelligence trait could be added to him and make the character more historically accurate. I suppose, therefore, a good CK3 campaign would be to play as him and see how much you could expand by. Paradox players also for some reason love Byzantium, so therefore maybe Paradox chose the 867 start date, so Paradox players could start a campaign for the Byzantium Empire. Although Basil I is not a recommended character to play as, so maybe this isn't a reason for Paradox to have picked the 867 start date. A final potential reason is the situation within Central Europe, which could be interesting for potential gameplay. Charlemagne's old empire is split among his descendants, and the Karling dynasty controlled modern-day France, West Germany, and Italy. His descendants therefore have claims on each other's kingdoms, and it could be a good CK3 campaign to try and put the empire back together, although it's still probably not the main reason for the 867 start date. All the other interesting things happening within this start date probably didn't have a bearing on why 867 was chosen, and just happened to be there. For me, it's fascinating though, why these CK3 start dates are relatively Anglo-centric. Perhaps it's because the UK has one of the biggest fan bases of Paradox games, and therefore it made sense to have them as a central piece within the game. So now we've somewhat understood why 867 both has historical relevance and makes for interesting gameplay, as the pagans are quite interesting characters to play as, and one of the main reasons why we had the new Viking DLC. Are there any other potential start dates that could have been chosen? 865 is an option, but that has already been discussed. So, if we stuck with an Anglo-centric theme, then perhaps we could fast forward to the significant events of King Alfred the Great's life. 871 is when he was proclaimed King of England, and this was a time that the Anglo-Saxons were in dire need of trying to reclaim the British Isles. The Vikings had virtually taken the whole of England, therefore a potential good campaign would be to play as Alfred and see if you can take back England for yourself, or potentially finish off the Anglo-Saxons as a great heathen army. If we aren't going Anglo-centric, then an important event happened within Central Europe during this time, and a man by the name of Charles the Fat died, which started the significant decline of Charlemagne's empire. Charles the Fat was seen as incredibly incompetent and a pushover, which was disastrous since he was leader of such a great empire. Charles the Fat was also in a childless marriage, and was unable to gain a strong and powerful heir. Upon his death in 888, historically the empire fell apart, and was never to be restored again. Playing in 888 therefore potentially gives you an opportunity to prevent the complete destruction of this historic empire. What do you guys think though? Should 867 be the main Crusader Kings 3 start date? Or are there potentially some better ones you can think of that would make the game more interesting to play? And do you guys prefer the 1066 start date or the 867 one? Let me know in the comments and make sure to subscribe. Shout out to our Patreons: ShadowSinger, Jado52, Kargon, Flyerton, Henriki, Redguard76, and Xiaomi. Your support means a lot, guys.